Oh my god. I used to wear tap-out glasses? That's not good. Hello and welcome to my little corner of the internet. Today I want to look at the trilogy of memoirs from a beloved YouTube personality commonly known as Dax Flame. If you've been an avid YouTube viewer like myself for a while, you'll likely remember Dax as a colossal YouTube channel that went almost completely silent once he started landing movie roles. Or if you're newer to YouTube, you'll certainly have seen him in the documentary created by YouTube titan Ian Idubbbs Carter. The books are not necessarily a trilogy, but I do recommend you read them in order of release date. The first being I'm Just Sitting on a Fence, The Secrets of Life, a self-help memoir, which does not contain the secrets of life, and any self-help you are able to extract is likely unintentional by the author. It is important to remember this book was written by a young Dax, and he had much more life to live and lessons to learn. But it is a memoir, and he do be sitting on a fence though. The second being Ice Cream Man, likely the most popular book due to its prominence in the Idubbbs documentary of the same name. And I'll be honest, it's my favorite book as well. It's not as thorough or overflowing with the same creative juices the first book is, but what it lacks it makes up for in conservative and intentional writing, as well as taking on the format more akin to the Book of Proverbs centering around Dax's life. And the third is Dax's Guide to Making Money as an Influencer. This, with all due respect, is my least favorite of the three. It's got the same format as the others, but much less content. Not to say I disliked it, I still really enjoyed reading the book, just if I had to choose a least favorite, it would be this one. And we will get into the reasons why pretty soon here. Before we get going, when describing what I like about the books, I'm likely just going to stop on a few pages that I thought were interesting or telling. Dax really flips between subjects, stories, and periods of his life throughout the books, so it's likely we're going to find giving this video a narrative pretty difficult. I will have a page number and chapter title at the bottom of the screen so you can follow along and read what it is I'm talking about if you like. I am shaking at the opportunity to finally talk about these books, so let's go.
Hello everyone, so this is the book I wrote. It's now available for sale on Amazon, and I will put a link in the description box below.
I feel I'm Just Sitting on a Fence is a beautifully apt metaphor for Dax himself as seen through this book. While people like you and I would go to the park, exercise for a bit, or play with the dog, after a while we'd find a nice quiet common bench to rest on, maybe feed the birds with the crumbs we left over from our lunch, until it's time for us to wrap up and go home. People like Dax would find a fence. We learn throughout this book Dax is completely unaware of how his words or actions deviate so drastically from the social norm, and causes him to be constantly breaking the well-established barriers society has come to expect from interactions with strangers. Not in a creepy way, mind you, Dax in all of his documented adventures never crosses into territory that I personally could think of or consider socially alarming, but he for sure subverts the usual experience most of us would expect to have. And I think that's why people weren't sure at the start of his career whether or not he was some extreme method actor. After a while, it does almost seem intentional. Like once you've read the first few chapters, you can get a feel for how he acts, and you can almost predict when a new situation is presented, how he is going to find the strangest way possible to respond or continue the interaction. And I think it lends credence to the magic that is this man's mystique and persona. I want to be clear, I'm not trying to measure Dax by his personality or his character. I, like with most things I'm talking about, am trying to judge his writing and explain why I think it's worth experiencing, or why I felt it was worth my experiencing, because I think I grow a lot from experiencing art. But with that said, I definitely have a bias here. I love Dax Flame. I'm an older internet user who's been a pretty big fan of Dax's for a while, and I think it's fair that when I say something very positive about these books, that you understand that that statement comes with the baggage of a fanatic. I deeply have enjoyed Dax's past and current work, and being totally honest in this specific situation, I don't think I'd enjoy the books as much if I hadn't had been in that mindset going in. I'm not trying to imply that you need to enjoy Dax's YouTube/film career to get the most out of these books. I don't feel that way at all. I think most people could pick maybe not this one, but the other two up just fine and have no issues having a good read. He does a great job at explaining his situations and ideas to readers who are uninitiated. However, I think watching a good sample of his YouTube videos and at least knowing the few movies he's been in will, 1, help you determine if the wild world of Dax is something you can even handle. He's not controversial or anything, but I have seen he isn't for everyone. I think he's great, but some people aren't as entertained or captivated somehow. And 2, make you curious about how he thinks. After watching Dax, I was curious about what kind of a person he was, and more importantly, how he thinks to approach situations he seems to always be getting himself into. And personally, I feel he's a fantastic natural writer, so there is an insight there that feels really eye-opening if you start with the YouTube videos and end with the books. Maybe I'll have a Dax Flame Essentials playlist in the description. Anyways, let's start to talk about the actual contents of the books. Most of the book is presented in an almost vlog-style format, surprise, where each chapter is just a separate thought or situation, where we will have one chapter about a childhood memory, and then the next chapter will be about a story from his global travels, and then the following chapter will be a collection of diary entries for a week. And I'm not sure if this is a structure Dax just invented or if it exists in other memoirs, and I just haven't found out about it until now, but I think I love it. It runs the extreme risk of being a boring-ass book, but Dax is such an enigmatic character that attacks the problems of his world in such a different way than I think most readers. It's actually really interesting to see which angles Dax will attempt to approach a problem, or even which situation Dax thinks is worth his time. And in both situations, I am always just a little surprised. Already, this is by far the most engaged I have been reading at a 5th grade level. A few chapters into the book, we really get something that really makes Sitting on a Fence special and stand out, amongst the other 2 books at least, which is we get these really short and, in my opinion, really entertaining stories written by Dax, sprinkled in between actual memories and diary entries. And the first one really is the best. It's called Billy's Big Birthday, and without spoiling too much, because I would like to see at least a very few of you pick up the books and read them for yourselves. It's essentially about a young boy who slowly realizes he's not like the rest of his family, and is afraid of what they have planned for his birthday, and sacks his revenge. In traditional Dax fashion, it does have an ending that would hit the mark if we were still keeping to the gruesome and cynical themes that Aesop intended for his fables, but the story itself is super entertaining. It would be pretty great to see it in film form. I'm not sure how you would be able to retain the plot twist in the video format, but I think it can be done, and it would make a really good short to be put into an anthology or an episodic show like Twilight Zone. It is a little Twilight Zone-y, I guess. I'm not sure if Rod Serling would agree with the theme, but I think he'd be all about the premise.
Once in a lifetime opportunity. This is your chance to enter a living, breathing fantasy world. Walk on the moon, swim in lakes of juice, fly without machines. All you have to do is step into our machine, which will teleport you to a land of never-ending happiness. Disclaimer, once you go, you may not return. You must go alone.
There are a few sections across all of the books that are unintentionally funny, and it makes me feel a bit mean, but they get me every time, and it's absolutely golden. Most notably in the first book, starting on page 46, he discusses his photography, a hobby I immensely appreciate and can relate with Dax on, but he's talking about the framing and color, and he's making, I'm sure, some very poignant and educated takes, but the photos are in black and white, and they're shaded with like halftone, so you can't see any color. Like, Amazon did him so wrong. I think that's how he published the books anyhow, was by self-publishing through Amazon's Create space. I'm not sure. I don't think a majority of it is Dax's fault, and you can view the photos on his website, and it gives you a link printed in the book to a video where he goes through his photographic process, which I found before through another video of his, which was actually really fun to type in that URL and be taken to a secret video that I had already found. And as a researcher, that certainly made me feel like I was doing a good job. I do think it's an absolute shame that Dax is having trouble finding work in entertainment, because he does have a very cinematic mind. Despite the string of strange decisions like the playful awkwardness that is Smoothie Madness and his dedication to that, Reading the necessary violence chapter in this book, Dax does a really great job at painting sequences into my head that I can't help but imagine scene by scene, with his words moving the camera in my imagination and cutting from shot to shot in the scenes he's describing. And it's really surprising to me. I personally have an issue with books not being able to put its images in my mind. I'm not a super visual thinker, so when I read a book, I'm often just trying my best to digest the words and what I think the author intended them to mean. But Dax is able to, so effortlessly it seems, just paint the image in there for my brain to project as opposed to me having to think hard. Dax is clearly pretty talented and very smart. However, in the chapter Teaching is a Two-Way Road, the closing statement is a good example of the sort of backwards way Dax can look at things sometimes. He wasn't applying himself in his classes according to his teachers, so they pulled him aside to let him know not to quit. And Dax has, in his teenage angst, tried turning the conversation around on the teacher and is attempting to make the teacher feel like he could have achieved more in his life, which is a confidence I certainly wish I had at that age. I think stories like this are funny, but also really intriguing, because in the situation he obviously doesn't see the age or experience gap here, only the gap of authority, which young teen Dax does not want to respect. But also, telling the story in his book 6 or 7 years later, he's kind of sticking to his guns. Like, if I were to write a memoir, I would use the experience to look back and see what memories I could learn from or have grown past, and use those experiences as teachable moments for the reader. But Dax doubles down on a lot, especially here, and I'm curious where he sits on stories like these today. Bonnie has to be my favorite chapter in the book. It's a pretty great summation of everything I think we've talked about so far. It's got the hilarity in the situations that he gets himself into. It's got the strange conclusions Dax can jump to sometimes, as well as shows a surprising depth in his thoughtfulness, and feels like Dax is genuinely sharing himself with the reader, in a way that almost feels like we are along for the ride, learning about him while through the writing of the memoir he is sort of discovering himself. A line that stuck out to me the most in this chapter, and the rest of the book for that matter, is on page 93. The mind is an interesting trumpet. I don't think that line specifically is prolific. It and everything implies just struck me as particularly beautiful, especially in the context of all the self-reflection that is happening in the chapter. And to solidify that, I want to juxtapose two sections of the book that I think show how Dax's writing prowess can differ. Yosemite thrived as a tourist destination. In the 40s, movie theaters were opened and they began to develop housing. The Indians were long gone at this point, but their legacy remains. In the 90s, things finally took a turn in a positive direction when the government began to shut down the hotels, housing, golf courses, theaters, etc., and made it a point to start preserving the nature. They have continued in this positive direction since then, but the history and violent legacy that the valley holds can never be erased. I learned most of this at a nice, or should I say educational, exhibit they have in the visitor center yesterday. God, it is sad. That's the problem with America. Its foundation, its roots, are based on slaughter and ramshack, corruption. It's such a young country, yet so corrupt from the beginning. That is why the youth, i.e. me, are forever searching for a non-existent home. If I accept my roots, I am accepting the massacring of an Indian who just had been forced to watch his crops and horse burn. Indians were peaceful, very in touch with nature in a religious way, so the pain that they felt as they watched their land and animals burned is incomprehensible to us. That is sad, and that's why things need to change. It's not impossible, it's not. Someone, a leader, needs to be good and honest. Is that fucking beautiful and insightful? Not only letting us know about his stance on our history and philosophy of why his generation feels largely dejected. How does the same person who wrote that in the same book write a spy action love triangle rivalry between Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, and Keira Knightley? I'm not someone who can judge Dax. I don't have the same set of skills. If I did, I don't think I'd be able to do any better. Everyone makes things that are corny or, I don't know, not as good as you possibly could do. I just find it fascinating that those two elements can exist in the same 100 or so pages. And it seems that Dax's writing is strongest when he's just letting himself go, not constraining himself to a box, and just being himself. That's just how I interpreted the literature, however. I could be totally off base. The book ends with a set of characters that are pretty much just the diary entries put into the third person, referring to himself as Timothy. And no, I'm not reading too much into it. He literally says that at the end of the first one. They are just a few experiences he has at the library while writing the book, and mostly these chapters specifically. I think I prefer the diary entries myself. They talk to the reader more directly, while the Timothy series is much more narrative driven and follows a more traditional book writing technique. Not saying I don't like them, it's fun to see Dax stauber it up and toss in another writing method to experiment with. I just much preferred the diary entries as I felt it was a more intimate look into his experience. Before we go, I want to turn back a few pages and talk about the chapter Lupus and the Erector. This is a pretty good story to end on, I think. If you've gone through the book being frustrated with Dax's seemingly antagonistic awkwardness, then this story offers a bit of a cathartic release of Dax getting his just desserts. Or if you, like me, have been reading kind of enjoying his wacky antics, then I think you'll genuinely sympathize with him here, because this really is like the worst Christmas any kid has ever had. The story takes place over a Christmas adventure, and has a fair bit of nuanced, mature themes present, like the repercussions of selfishness and greed, as well as like unjustified loss, all from a child's perspective. And they don't feel ham-fisted or forced into the narrative, which is something I think the book struggles a little bit with in earlier chapters. And actual question here, not trying to build interest for you viewers to buy and read the books, do you think the ending of this chapter is symbolic or literal? This is likely just me being unable to read between the lines, but upon first reading, I thought Dax and Lupus had actually been reunited, but I suppose it could be figurative, like the story he wrote has made him realize he's been with Dax the whole time. I don't know. Buy the book, you tell me. At the beginning of this video, I insinuated that a lot of the value of this book is likely unintentional, and I regret that a little bit. I think the stigma around Dax and where his career has gone, as well as his online persona, makes him seem like a goofy, socially awkward guy, which he absolutely is. But I think it would be a huge mistake, one that I feel has made an awful lot, to underestimate Dax and his artistic mind. I think if you go into this book with that idea in your head, you'll be pleasantly surprised with just how complex and genuine a lot, admittedly not all, his writings are. To summarize the book a little unfairly, I think a good sampler would be a paragraph from page 150. The day before, Timothy had come to the library and spent 5 hours attempting to write anything usable for his book. He'd written a couple sentences of promising but aimless fiction, a page and a half of unsuccessful third-person nonfiction, and 1 or 2 deleted sentences of even less successful first-person nonfiction. But he had also written 4 good sentences, sentences that he wanted to be seen, so he decided to put them at the end of this Word document right here. Reader, if I could, I would reach up out of this page and slap you across the face. That, I think, is a pretty good taste of what this book is like to read. Just full of strange, funny quips from a fascinating author. On to book 2!
Hi, I've been working at an ice cream shop for quite a while now, and I wrote a book about it called Ice Cream Man.
Okay, so if you're not a subscriber of my channel, you are likely here because of this book and the documentary. This is the book with the infamous sabotage chapter, and the game show they go on to make, and Dax continues. They do go through a few of the entertaining chapters, but there is plenty in the book they didn't cover as it wasn't the focus of the documentary. The book follows the same outsider-author structure as Sitting on a Fence does. While Fences followed him from childhood to after his most notable roles, Ice Cream Man follows Dax's life after his acting money has mostly run out and his struggle to live in LA with a job that is less than fulfilling. Ice Cream is considerably shorter than Sitting on a Fence, and with that the chapters are much shorter as well. Each page or few pages is a new thought, day, or experience, and we've almost entirely abandoned the diary format that the first book used off and on. Ice Cream Man is much more intimate with Dax's personal thoughts. While we are told some stories about the past like in the previous book, it is framed in a way that is more obvious that Dax is either dwelling or reminiscing on these stories, as opposed to Fences, where I think the mood was more in those moments without the distance we feel in Ice Cream Man. I think the biggest difference in tone between the two books mostly has to do with money. In the first book, it's usually an afterthought. He'd mention a few details about how much he's made just to explain certain situations that he finds himself in, like why we're suddenly in Rome for a chapter, but it's never the focus or a point of contention at all. Where in Ice Cream Man, it's still not the main focus, but it's more of a plot point, I guess. A lot of the strife in Ice Cream Man I think could be resolved by Dax just having a reliable, livable income, where in Fences, a lot of the struggle was caused by his awkward demeanor. Starting off on page 24, after he's acclimated us to his new life and living situation, it is comforting, for me anyhow, to read chapters like The Owners and see his slightly awkward and persistent character has held up through the length of time that the two books were published, despite all of the maturing and adult life hardships he's endured. A lot of people changed considerably during the amount of time, myself included, and I'm happy that he wasn't pressured or felt the need to remove that part of himself, because it is magical to imagine somewhere out there Dax is still pretty much being classic Dax. Moving on to my favorite chapter in this book, and it's a short one. I think it would be okay to read and kind of give a perspective on the breakneck speeds you get whipped around on in Dax books. Just for context, the story is sandwiched between a chapter about his frustrations with his current coworkers at his day job and a short chapter about faking being sick. When I lived back home in middle school, I used to slide notes under the bathroom door when my mom was in there to try to make her think a stranger was in the house. They'd say things like, "We've taken your son." And one more time, I'd like to call attention to the distance that this chapter has. With just a sentence, I can feel Dax is reminiscing about his childhood, while in the Fences, the same sort of stories did not sound so far away in his memory. You never realize you're living in the good old times. And that's something I think rings true here. Our entire lives are good old times, and it's important to live in the now, as well as take time to reminisce like Dax is here. For those of you who have watched the iDubbbz documentary and haven't bought the book yet, a little fun fact, most of the narration from the documentary in their Sabotage segment actually came from the chapter Sabotage 2. I think both of them are equally funny, so if you grab the book, you can read the OG chapter. And continuing that sentiment, this chapter is either some strange poetry I'm unaware of, or something else. It's just curly-haired Ice Cream Man repeated several times. I wonder if he is judging himself or if someone referred to him as that and it bothered him. The chapter is closed with several pages of photos. I actually enjoy much more than the first book's photos, and of course they are in Amazon self-published standard black and white. The intimacy we have with Dax's thoughts, in my opinion, is amplified here, as it feels like we are spending all of our time in his head as opposed to the previous book, where I think it felt more like we were traveling around with him. Personally, the format of this book is much more enjoyable. I think in Fences, we never knew what was going to be on the next page or chapter. It could be a story, childhood memory, movie pitch, or diary entry. Whereas Ice Cream Man, the topics are different, it's all pretty homogenous, and focuses on the way Dax is feeling or thinking. I think a better word would be subdued as opposed to homogenous. It's a lot calmer of a book, I guess. I'll be honest, I think Ice Cream Man is probably my favorite of the three books. The ease of the read is at its best, like the flow of everything stands above the rest, and you can go through this book realistically in a few hours. You aren't going to be stuck in parts that might not be as interesting. Like in Fence, if you were just interested in Dax's life and didn't want to read any of his zany stories, you'll end up skipping or slogging through some chapters just to get to the parts that engage you the most. 3 out of 3 best Dax Flame book.
Hello, this is my first memoir, I'm Just Sitting on a Fence. This is my second memoir, Ice Cream Man. And this is my new memoir.
This book follows the same pacing and structure as Ice Cream Man. This isn't Dax Flame's guide to making money as an influencer. It's the Communist Manifesto! How did I do that? This book follows the same pacing and structure as Ice Cream Man, and I feel if Dax kept releasing books just like these, I would be happy following along and I'd keep picking them up. Oh, and before we get much further, we should probably talk about the title. I don't want to spoil too much because it does get revealed in the book, but this is in fact not a guide to making money as an influencer. I'm not sure if you guys can tell, but Dax doesn't exactly have the best strategy of his own pinned down on how to do that, so I think giving advice in that space could be ill-advised. But I find that to be a really exciting and fun idea. The title is related to a few stories in the book, but it is still misleading in a way. When I first picked it up, I was a little bummed, not super excited to get advice on running a YouTube channel, just because it's nice figuring it out on your own as you go. I was pleasantly surprised and entertained by the book's little twist. The first few chapters go over the process of his indoor garden idea and the documentary that was made as a Kickstarter goal, something I was surprised wasn't talked much about in the Ice Cream Man book, but maybe while he was reeling from the experience, he wasn't very excited to write about it. The following chapter, Ojai, kicks off the plot, I suppose, for the rest of the book, where Dax finds himself planning a website to help people wanting to be influencers, which segues directly into the title chapter? What do you call a chapter that's named the title of the book? Where the book dates itself as the coronavirus has just struck the United States. The book is mostly Dax finding ways to cope with the isolation, confusion, and uncertainty that the pandemic shoved onto most of us, as well as his journey through the influencer book/website. And in the trilogy, this one is the shortest, which is about the only thing I can say I don't like about it, honestly. It hits the same beats I love in the first book, with the format I think he perfected in Ice Cream Man, just with better writing, and a more compelling subject. That being life at the beginning of lockdown. For instance, in the chapter Spinning Away, you can feel Dax's panic and manicness. At the end, Dax claims this is the final memoir. I certainly hope not. While I do think trilogies are a great and good stopping point, Dax I think clearly gets a lot out of writing, and I certainly get a lot out of reading his works, so I hope he has a few more left in him, even if he feels he needs to frame them in a less of a memoir way so he can stay true to the Memoir Trilogy promise. Dax is a person who looks and interprets the world in a way I think most of us wish we could. The fact that he has been able to find his audience and succeed on the internet has warmed my heart, and I wholeheartedly believe Dax will continue to persevere and be successful. I think that can be attributed to him being able to cultivate an audience that genuinely cares about him and wants to see him succeed in the most honest way. And I'm happy to say I'm one of those people, even if it's so I can selfishly be sure he has the time, energy, and confidence to make more books. And I loved these books. They have the energy of an anthology or an off-the-air-esque show where you are being whipped around from happy to funny to sad stories in his surreal life, but they still have a good beat and pace to them. And for what I am to assume is a beginner author, I wasn't disappointed. It was clear during the first book that he was still getting his footing and learning how to write, but as soon as he never slowed down, and the ideas appear to have spilled onto the page. 3 books later, Dax is still one of my favorite authors. The books aren't exactly fiction, but they are absolutely fantastical, and a look into the life of someone most of us look up to and can respect. It's a personal and intimate view I think many of us couldn't get any other way. And the subject matter is something I don't think would fit in a YouTube video, so we're learning more about Dax than I think we possibly could, and I'm grateful for that. I highly recommend you pick up these books and read them for yourselves. You can grab all 3 of them for like 26 bucks, and paired with his YouTube videos, it will fully immerse you into the world of Dax Flame.
Dax Flame, you're my friend. Dax Flame, you're my friend. I want you to know I like you as a friend.